At first, it was very intimidating. And like that first week, it was a lot because it was the New York Times and NPR and coming to my house and like NBC News. Like it was really intimidating those first few weeks. And I'm sure I stumbled a lot. And I learned that it was always better not to prepare and to just speak. If you speak your truth, and you speak from your heart, you can't mess up. And so it comes off as being more natural than if you're overly prepared, for sure. Well, the funniest one was NPR came to the house, and she didn't tell me right when she walked in, there's a big box that they have on them, which is their microphone. And so she walked in the house, and as she was walking in, my dogs are barking, and my husband's like, Donna's in her office. And, we're like, it was very natural. And so when the interview actually came out, that was what it was. It was, hearing the noises in my home and what had been going on. And she even said she was passing the NBC News crew as she was coming in. He was going out. And it was kind of funny because she kind of incorporated all this, probably something like all chaos is broken loose in her house. And that's what it felt like. It was total chaos. Well, I grew up in Taft. And so CSUB, when I was there, this is going to age me, but it was kind of a new university. It hadn't been around for a really long time. And so when I initially left, I went to college at a UC school my first year. And my parents are both teachers. We didn't have a ton of money for my sister and I to both be going to college at the same time. And so my dad had the chat with me about finances. And, if you want to go finish college and go to graduate school, you're going to have to rethink your path. So I moved in with my sister. We lived in an apartment off of Camino Media. And I figured out immediately when I started taking classes that I was no longer a number here. And it wasn't going to be easier. It was going to be more difficult than that UC school, but that I wasn't going to be left to fall through the cracks like a lot of students are at big universities. You have a couple of opportunities and tests each quarter or semester to prove yourself, and it wasn't that here. And so a huge part of Cal State, I was really close to my advisor, Dr. Weinheimer, and I was a biology major. I worked for the chemistry department. I don't think I told you that, but I worked, and there were doctors or professors doing research and other things, but I worked for the chemistry department on campus, but I was a bio major. And I really got to know the other students. You become a family and you rely on one another, whether it's in labs, but the same went for professors. And so when during the coursework, it was just a totally different experience than what what had happened at the UC system. And so it felt like I was getting a far better education. Nothing against the UC system, but it wasn't for me. And I found that here at Cal State, I really could delve into the things that I was interested in as well, and the research I did. I hope no one ever goes and looks at what my senior thesis was, because it was so weird. But I'll tell you, I was studying the effect of bovine saliva on brome grass. My aunt and uncle had a ranch not far from here, and I was out on dehorning days scraping saliva. And I don't know if it's still here, but there was a greenhouse on the opposite side of campus, and I had my grass growing, and I would clip the grass. I had a control where I'd clip the grass, and then I had another sampler where I'd brush the saliva and see if amylase had an effect on it. I think I probably am the only person in the country who's ever done that study. And turns out it didn't matter. But it didn't affect the growth of grass. But who does that? And to be able to have that kind of the freedom to study and to do things and to write about things. I could have never done that at another university. So there were parts of Cal State that were like a little quirky like that, but it totally shaped me and my imagination and the way that I come up with stories and other things to not have a stifling experience. I had an experience where I was allowed to really study and do things that came from my imagination. And I think as writers, that's what we do. Our imaginations are there. So even within, the sciences, I was allowed to do that here. Well, I always wanted to be a writer, even from a young age. And I kept a journal. I always would write short stories. And when I graduated when I was 17, and my parents were like, I think they were a little bit worried about my wanting to become a writer. I think they thought, I was good in the sciences as well. I was a good student. And so it was the 80s, and they're like, oh, you should be a doctor or a lawyer or something like that. And so I went into the sciences, but it was always in the back of my mind wanting to be a writer. And I had shared with you earlier that when it came to taking upper division writing courses, I decided to test out. I went to West High School and sat in the cafeteria and took and I didn't know if I was going to pass the test, but it turns out I passed the test. And it's one of my biggest regrets, because I lost this opportunity to learn. And I think a lot of times as students, we feel like we have to be on the fast track to finish with our education. And it's such an opportunity to, be with other students and to learn a topic that we may not have ever studied before. And I was just in too big of a rush at that time. And later in life, I went back and took those courses that I had missed out on because I tested out. And I think it's important to remember that education isn't about the degree at the end. It's really, truly about the journey and what you're gathering and taking with you, and the knowledge so maybe not be in such a rush like I was. So it's a weird thing. So everybody knows that there's like an award season coming up, and I guess I knew it, but it was not even on my radar. There was a lot of times there are books that people know are being considered for awards, and because the Newbery's like the award, the biggest award, there's buzz, and they have these mock Newbery contests where it's kind of like they pit books against each other and they rank them, and then you end up with who people predict at the end. I wasn't on any of those. My book wasn't. My book was released end of October, and so most of these mock Newberys started long before that in the spring, and so nobody was talking about my book. And I was on vacation with my family, and my publicist sent an email and said, Barnes & Noble wants to have a Zoom meeting with you on Saturday. I'm like, what? And on Saturday? And she goes, well, they work really hard during the week, so we want to have this meeting. I'm like, okay. And she goes, well, they also want a meeting with you on Sunday. And it was something about my first book, Lupe Wong Won't Dance. They were doing a paperback version. This is her story. And they also wanted to do virtual visits for kids. And I'm like, oh, anything for the kids, fine, I'll meet with you on Sunday. So I log into this Zoom meeting on Saturday, and there were way too many faces for this to be a Barnes & Noble meeting. And it was the Pura Belpre Committee, which is another committee with the American Library Association, for a book with a character of Latina descent. And so, the Last Quintista had won this, and of course, it's a huge honor, and I'm emotional, and I'm crying, and the publisher and my editor are on this Zoom call, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they totally fooled me. And they said, okay, we're going to talk to you on the phone afterwards. So we're all in this group talk, and I'm like, okay, so tomorrow is the real Barnes & Noble meeting? And they're like, yes. And I just bought it hook, line, and sinker. And I'm like, okay. So I log on to the meeting the next day. Again, the new number, or the number that they gave me, the same name popped up. And so I thought that I was interrupting someone else's Zoom moment, and I was apologizing and going, oh my gosh. And I didn't notice that behind them, their wallpaper was all the cover of my book. And I started to see faces. There were like 30 people on this Zoom call. And I saw my editor, and because he also edits other writers and amazing writers. So I'm like, oh, I messed up. This is me. And then a gentleman said, my name's Tad Andraki, and I am the committee leader of the Newbery Committee. And so I will tell you, somebody filmed that or was recording this, and I'm both horrified and really happy because it caught this moment, but that you can see this mix of emotions on my face. And I went through a lot in the course of 30 seconds. And you can see shock and then kind of horror and then like just no one can tell you how you're going to feel in that moment, but I got the emotion when people say it feels like someone pulled the carpet out from beneath you. That's what it felt like, because I knew that my life was never going to be the same in those few seconds. It was one of those things as a writer that you never ever would dream that something like that would happen to you. And it wasn't anywhere in my scope of knowledge that could happen to me, but also my book, it just came out. No one had ever said anything. And so for that to happen was huge. And then I went out and to tell my family, and I thought I was controlling my emotions. And my husband's also a writer. And so he writes middle grade fiction as well. And so to have somebody who understood what that moment meant for all of us and our family was pretty amazing.
That is so cool, just the raw emotion. And then, so for those who don't maybe understand what that means to win the Newbery, can you talk a little bit about, what the Newbery is, other books that have, had this honor before as well, their authors, and then just kind of what it means to win the Newbery Medal?
So the John Newbery Medal is the book chosen. I always get the exact quote wrong, but it's the book of highest literary contribution for children's literature in that given year. And so they choose one book per year for the Newbery Medal. They do have honor winners as well, but there's one Newbery Medal winner. And then over the course from when they began, they started giving a few honor winners to honors as well. And it was the 100th anniversary the year that I won. And so it was, no pressure. It was a lot. And so, this is great. Because when I was a kid, I would look for the books with the gold sticker in the library. And for me, that book was A Wrinkle in Time. And having my book alongside A Wrinkle in Time, and, there's just a huge list, The Giver, and books that I grow up, like Bud Not Buddy, like so many books that were huge for me. Did you know Charlotte's Web got an honor? It didn't even win the medal that year. And the book that won the medal, a lot of people don't remember, but so many books that formed us as kids were Newbery Medal winners. And I was at the American Library Association banquet and about to give my speech, and they started showing the history of the Newbery Medal. And you could just hear people gasping around the room, like books that they loved. And they had quotes of the authors, and the authors were speaking and recordings, some of them, 50, 60 years old. And Margaret L. Ingle came up, and it was A Wrinkle in Time, and she was speaking about her book. And I just, of course, goosebumps, because it was the first real science fiction book that I read and I loved. And I was sitting there watching in that moment, and then the next moment, my book cover came up. And I don't even remember recording anything, but having that, like this book that meant so much to me, and then having and being categorized with something like that, it is beyond humbling, and it's otherworldly. You go, okay, I'm surely living in an alternate universe. This is probably something that Margaret L. Ingle wrote about, and I'm actually just in a weird, different little dimension within one of her books. But that's what it feels like. It is very bizarre, but being in the company of others who have won the Newbery Medal before me, and now they're my friends. We email and text each other, and people I would have been really intimidated by before, I really call them friends, and I can call and ask advice, and the same, like we interact with one another. And now the new Newbery Medal winner, the day after she won, she and I were on the phone for like over an hour just talking, and it's kind of like this little secret club, like a treehouse of trust, where we can all talk to one another about our fears and anxieties, but also the responsibilities that come with this, because you are a liaison for children. And I travel a lot, and I do a lot of school visits. It's my favorite thing. And to me, it's the most important thing, is connecting with children like Margaret L. Ingle connected with me. Well, we were talking a little bit, the first few weeks were just complete chaos. And the Newbery's interesting because they used to call people in the middle of the night. They would call them at like 3 to 5 in the morning, and they would just keep calling until people answered their phones. But in today's day and age, people don't answer their phones so much if they don't recognize it. So it's always like them trying to figure out how they're going to call people. And so when we had this Zoom call, they announced it the next morning, and they said, okay, you can't tell anybody. Don't tell your family. Don't tell anybody. So I quickly got off the phone and called my dad and told him, and then called my friend. I'm like, really? I'm going to keep this a secret? And then they announce it the next morning. And one of the publicists for the publishing house said, hey, I know it's really early for you, but you need to make sure, it was like 5 a.m. He goes, make sure that you are up and dressed and you have hair and makeup and all. I'm like, what? And I thought, who's gonna, like, it's 8 o'clock in New York, who's gonna care? And as soon as they announced it, my phone sounded like it was like singing, and just phone call after phone call and interview. And that went on for several days. And as I told you, I was on vacation with my family. So my poor family, we had to kind of navigate all of it. It was a good thing, but it was a lot. And it hasn't, it's definitely slowed down with interviews and such, but it's not a daily thing, but it still happens really often. There's always interviews going on. I travel a lot, and that can be tiring. I think it sounds really exciting at first to be traveling around the country and speaking all the time, but airports get old after a while. And so I'm going to be glad when I can stay home a little while and just read and write, and I have chickens in my garden, and there are things that I just want life to settle down a little bit. But trust me, I don't take anything for granted. It has been so magical and so wonderful. I have met the best and most amazing people. I've been like to the Library of Congress. Like I have met, like it's been amazing, and I'm so grateful for that. But I'm ready for life to slow down a tiny bit. Yeah, I think that it's important in a lot of different things in life not to just get so focused on one thing. It's good to learn and study other things as well. You don't have to just do one thing. You can explore your artistic side and do things that maybe you didn't think were going to be part of your life and your journey, but along the way also figuring out ways to give back. And for me, it's become, about kids. And I still am, but I'm also an eye doctor. And so I practiced for many, many years. And just this last year, I had to sell my practice. It was really heartbreaking because I loved my patients. They're like family, but I couldn't do both. There was no way to navigate and do both. I had to travel so much, and I do miss it. But it's okay for your life to wear different hats at certain points and to try different things. And it doesn't mean because people go, oh, you're so brave. I'm not brave. I'm just curious. Stay curious and about different topics and things that you might want to learn and study. It's okay to have multiple degrees just because you're curious, and go back to school and learn more, which is what I have done. But again, along the way, figure out ways that with that knowledge that you're doing something good with it, give back in a way, and only you can figure out what that is for you. And for me now, it's connecting to kids and making sure that they know that if they want to be a writer or they want to be an artist, they can, and not to give up on that dream. Well, I got a little bit lost coming in because it does not even remotely resemble what it was. There's so many new buildings, and you can't drive through the center of campus anymore to go to the office. And so I think a lot of it changed shortly after I left. So it still feels like home. I can still, there are things I recognize and see, and it still feels comfortable, and it feels like home. And there are very few places that I think we can feel that way about in life. And when I come home here, this is one of those places. It's changed a lot, especially the surrounding area and the neighborhoods. I don't recognize it at all. But the second I went into campus, I'm like, I know that building. That one's new, but I know that one. And I spent a lot of time in that building. And so it's comfortable. And so being here, it's a reminder of the people that formed me, who I was here with. I'm wondering a lot, like it sparks memories, and I'm wondering what happened to certain people. And yeah, it's a good feeling. It's a really good feeling. I know a lot of times people look back on their education and go, oh, it was so hard. I don't feel that way at all. This was a magical place for me. It's so different. Every writer has their own way of their writing process. And I think for me, a lot of people say, oh, you just have to sit down in the chair and start writing. And part of that's true. And when I start plotting a story out, I do that. But a big part of it for me, it plays out like a movie in my mind first. And I kind of see people and images and ideas of what I want to write. And so I'll just sit down and write a scene of what I've kind of seen and played out in my mind first. And it's a huge jumbled mess when I first write it out. And people say, well, how has it grown and changed? They think that somehow I can magically sit and put this book out. It is a ton of work. Like writing a book takes me typically at least a year. And that's just a first draft. And then it has to go through multiple revisions and edits with an editor. And it's just a ton of work. And so I don't take it lightly. And I know that it's never going to be easy. And I was on a panel last week with Lois Lowry, who wrote The Giver. I know I'm like, she's sitting right next to me. And she was talking about how she had written this book and she was really proud of it and nobody wanted to publish it. Lois Lowry has won the Newbery Medal twice. That's almost unheard of. That just doesn't happen. And here is somebody who completed an entire book and nobody wanted to publish it. At least she says, and I believe her if she said that. But I thought about that, and writing is never going to be easy. And at each project that I work on, it's just as hard as, if not harder than the one before, because now people are watching. And so it's really difficult. But for me, the process, there is a point where you do have to sit down in the seat and actually get the job done. And for me, I can't work at home. I thought I would be able to, and I have to leave my house. I have to go sit somewhere where it feels like a job. I am going to go sit, work, and this is a job now. It is not just me casually looking out at the mountains and writing something down. It just doesn't work that way. So very humbling. Yeah, to have somebody read your words and then create these amazing pieces of art. And there's so many different artists who have worked on my books, and especially the novels. Like when somebody reads your novel and then creates artwork for that, and they've taken your words and made just something really beautiful. And my daughter always says for The Last Quintista, she's like, oh, Mom, your book could be horrible and people would still buy it because the cover is so beautiful. And I'm like, that is so true. Most of the people are artists, and that is what they do full time. But sometimes, like with The Last Quintista, the artist had never done a book cover. She was a fabric designer in the Philippines. And for Lupe Wong Won't Dance, it was a gentleman who was an album, like a record album designer in the UK. And so the artists come from and he'd never done a book cover. And so the picture books are a different story because that is different. They are storytellers in themselves. And so they just take these words that I wrote and they write and illustrate their own story. And so those are really magical people who can just take these simple words and like turn it into something really beautiful. And it's these are different animals. I don't think that way. And it's just always really humbling to see what they come up with. I think in all things, we need to really be protective of those, because if we look back, many of us, if we look back on our lives and we say, well, what was your favorite thing? It's normally a book or a song or a piece of art. And we don't really remember or care about these things are really important too, but we don't go, oh, I loved like learning fractions. So like the things that are really beautiful and amazing, we have to protect them just as much as we do something that is, we might think of in a different way in the learning process. And you're right, because I think a lot of people, the funding isn't always there for the arts, which is why a lot of writers, we give of our time to teach kids and to kind of make sure that those things are continuing. And I wish it were different. I don't know that it can be. And I think, right now the elephant in the room is we have so much going on with book banning and things like that. And when I was writing The Last Quintista, part of the book, like her biggest fear is the loss of literature and the loss of art and the loss of books. And the reason I wrote that is because something that I fear the most, like if somebody said, what's the worst thing that, what's most valuable to you? And if you were going to take it across the universe, what would it be? And for me, that's what it was. It was story and literature. And so people ask me all the time now, they're like, how did you know? How did you know that this was all going to be happening in real time? And I'm like, I didn't know. I was just writing about what I was afraid of, and look what's happening again. Like the arts and literature, things being banned were, we look at, how long ago, we know those things happened in the past in certain, it happened a lot throughout history, and it was always really scary. When things start to get banned and people start to be censored and know that you can't speak, that's when scary times are coming typically. And so I wrote about what scared me the most, and here we are again. And so, when we look at the arts and literature, we really have to protect them. We have to protect them for kids because they need to be able to have what we had. So, as far as the folklore and mythology that were incorporated into the book, again, I was thinking about story and how valuable it was to me. But I thought a lot about like snippets of stories that I had heard as a child. And when I was writing this story, with the first draft, I would say, oh, and at this point, Petra tells a story to remind the kids. And my editor came back and he's like, what are you doing? And I'm like, what? And he goes, why don't you actually tell us the story instead of telling us that you're going to tell us the story? And so going back and that oral tradition of storytelling, we always think of the written word. And, my grandmother stopped going to school when she was 10 years old. She had to help support her family. And so there was a lot more of the oral tradition of storytelling. And I wanted to pay homage to that. Like a lot of us, we come from families that, might have been field-in farm workers. And then, there was an untimely death and kids had to go to work. And it was, just how people connected through storytelling. And I wanted to pay homage to that, which is why I wrote those stories into the book. And I love going to ESL schools where kids recognize the stories and they, you just see their faces brighten up and they're smiling. It's really important for everybody to feel seen.